Welcome to the Rainy Day Rabbit Holes podcast, your escape from the mundane.
Dive into the rich history of the Pacific Northwest with us and let your mind wander down the rabbit hole.
Because in the Northwest, it's always raining something weird. How did Roy Olmsted, a man of the law, plunge into the shadows of bootlegging, weaving a tale of intrigue and rebellion against prohibition? I am Shay.
And I'm Jody. Let's fall down the rabbit hole.
The salty tang of the Puget Sound could be tasted in the air on the chilly, damp morning of November 26, 1925. It was around 2 a.m. Thanksgiving Day, and Roy Olmsted, known to some as the gentleman bootlegger and to the papers as the king of the bootleggers, hoped to be home in time to creep into his warm bed with his beautiful wife, Elsie, before enjoying a holiday meal with family and friends. As he waited on the Woodmont dock in Des Moines, Washington, he shivered and pulled his long wool overcoat tighter around him. The waves splashed against the footings of the dock, the water hiding its secrets in its black depths. The moon was almost full and illuminated the hull of the Three Deuces as it approached the dock, running lights extinguished. Roy loved the rumble of the engine of this boat, twin 300 horsepower Sterling Dolphins, which gave it an impressive speed of 30 knots, enough to outrun the prohibition agents that patrolled the coast. Roy and his good friend Al Hubbard, along with the nephew-in-law of the King County Sheriff, wasted no time in helping their workers to offload the cases of fine Canadian and Scottish liquor, 240 cases in total, into the waiting souped-up Packards. As the men worked, a swarm of federal agents materialized like phantoms, their badges and revolvers gleaming in the moonlight, and rushed towards the dock. "Roy Olmsted, you're under arrest," declared one of the officers, his voice cutting through the night with the authority of the law. Roy's gaze flickered with a mixture of resignation and defiance as he raised his hands in a gesture of reluctant surrender. The arrest was not unexpected. He had danced on the razor's edge of legality for years, evading capture through wit, charm, and cunning. As the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Roy spared a fleeting glance towards the boat, regret for the loss of another fine boat in his eyes. He's already lost the Estrella, the Elsie, and the Zambesi. With a sigh, Roy Olmsted surrendered to the inevitable, his arrest marking the end of an era defined by audacity and ambition. The waves lapped gently against the wooden pilings of the dock, bearing witness to the fall of a man who had dared to challenge the laws of his time. As the officers led Roy away, the moon casting long shadows on the beach, he couldn't help but reflect on the twists of fate that brought him to this moment. He cast his mind over his life, from his time in the Seattle police force to the lavish parties held at his Mount Baker home, and all of his narrow escapes from the law. The path that led him from the precinct to the shadows is as complex and riveting as the man himself. Bum, bum, bum. So let's rewind to the beginning.
Okay. Back
I'm doing a train spotting thing
Gotcha.
here. Wait, hold on. Say it.
I haven't seen it. You can almost guarantee it.
I figure if I mention a movie, you probably have no idea what I'm talking about.
No, pretty much never.
Doing the train spotting storytelling thing where you start at the end and you rewind to the beginning.
I actually heard that's. I knew what you were referencing, but I have not seen the movie.
Okay. So Seattle in the 1920s was still a rough place. During the Yukon Gold Rush of the late 1800s, our favorite time, Seattle was filled with men stopping in the city to fill up on supplies before heading north to Alaska. Demand for ways to fill the time as they waited for their supplies and ships created a thriving industry of vice, especially in the Pioneer Square area of the city, with saloons, gambling halls, cigar stores, and brothels aplenty.
Where Pioneer Square got its name.
It was
the Pioneers.
Some good times to be found down there. Drunken men stumbled down the street, much to the consternation of the respectable women who lived in the city. Many a
Clutch
Karen.
my pearls.
I was about to say, many a Karen clutched her pearls and marched away in disgust.
I would have giggled at all of them.
So the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the WCTU, had a mission. They wanted to make alcohol illegal. They saw drinking as a sin that promoted bad behavior in mankind. Now, they had a little bit of a point because there was a lot of domestic abuse at this time. and a lot of it came at the hands of drunken men.
Especially, seems like they were drinking a lot of like whiskey. That brown liquor.
There's a lot of hard.
That brown liquor makes
And
you
not
mean.
all of it high quality.
Right.
So you put some methanol in there and it's affecting your brain even worse.
Yeah.
So the WCTU had been in King County since 1883. And in the early 1900s led a campaign for dry laws. No alcohol.
No, yeah.
Which worked. With support from the Anti-Saloon League and religious leaders like Reverend Mark Matthews, who we could do a whole story on. He, by the way, founded Seattle's first megachurch. So he had his church that he was the pastor of was Seattle's first Presbyterian church, and he grew it to be 10,000 members. And that was the biggest congregation of all Presbyterian churches
in America.
Anywhere.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that was basically like the first megachurch was Seattle. So many firsts in Pacific Northwest, good and bad.
Some are good. Yes, I was just going to say, some are bad.
Seattle was ahead of the times on a lot of things.
Ugh.
So,
I would have pictured that one coming out of the South, but
right. Well, and the funny thing is Seattle has always been and still is one of the least churchy cities in the nation. Like people are more into science than religion here.
So it is very fascinating that he had the largest, or he had the first megachurch.
Yeah. They were just more into drinking and whoring than...
Was he making a lot of money at his megachurch?
That I don't know. I'd have to research more, and I'm interested to see if there's any scandal around him. I mean, he seemed to be just like a fire and brimstone type of dude. And it does actually, when I was reading about him, it does actually seem like he did a lot of really good things. Like he did a lot of charity, a lot of founding of organizations that helped people. So I think he actually was a good religious zealot.
So like his intentions were in the right place.
Yes.
His actions were maybe a little bit.
Got riled up about
things.
drinking and sin. And I mean, to be fair,
right.
there was a lot of that.
I mean, that was, if you weren't doing it, you were different.
You were either drinking and whoring or you were very religious. There was only two. There was no middle ground.
And surviving how? I don't know, because the drinking and the whoring was probably taking advantage of you in some way or not.
Well,
you know what
I think one of the things I was reading in Brad Holden's book, by the way, guys, I got so much of this information from the book Seattle Prohibition, Bootleggers, Rum Runners, and Graft in the Queen City by author Brad Holden, which was so good. Oh my gosh, it was so thorough, so fantastic. And he did say that at the time, saloons were kind of a newer thing, especially when you got out into the countryside, just because it was harder to get stuff out to small little towns, right? So these saloons started popping up, and all of a sudden, it was a place where these men would go and get just plowed. They would spend all of their money and time in these bars and then go home and beat their wives. So it was actually like bad things were happening. So Reverend Matthews was definitely like a fire and brimstone preacher, and he would stand on street corners and preach about the sins of booze and gambling and prostitution. And so he convinced city leaders to dry out the city. Reverend Matthews used inflammatory speeches that described saloons as, quote, the most fiendish, corrupt, and hell-soaked institution that has ever crawled out of the slime of the eternal pit. It's pretty good.
Probably accurate.
It's pretty good, Reverend Matthews. I applaud you on your creative writing skills.
Yeah. He probably didn't have one of those synonym tools.
He didn't have ChatGPT.
He didn't have any of that.
According to Matthews, the saloon, quote, takes your sweet, innocent daughter, robs her of her virtue, and transforms her into a brazen, wanton harlot. What do you think of us?
Is that right? Is that how they got to be there doing that job? They were sweet, innocent daughters somewhere, not...
right? Yeah, no, I don't think that's what happened. I don't think that the sweet, innocent daughters of the upper crust were like heading down to the Tenderloin and having a drink in a saloon, and all of a sudden they were a sex worker in a box house, right?
Exactly. That's a pretty big leap. I mean, maybe it happened once. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sure. But also maybe she actually wanted to do it. Maybe she was like, kind of like this.
Right. You're right. That's exactly what I mean. Like every once in a while, I'm sure that happened. But as a most part, your daughters are not at risk.
Well, in this, like a little adjunct, and I'm not going to go into this very deep, but I was seeing in some of my research that there was a lot of problem in the 1800s and early 1900s of women from countries like China and Japan being tricked to come over here, thinking that they're going to come over here and marry a respectable man. So it was kind of like a whole mail order bride thing. And they would come over here and they were just sex slaves. And so then they would sell them. Yeah, they weren't getting husbands. They were getting forced into the sex trade. And then those sex slaves would be sold in the Pacific Northwest. And I think one thing I saw, they were sold for $400.
Wow. Sold to be
sex slaves.
They were here.
And then
we sold them to
these, I think like
out.
These brokers were like bringing them over en masse.
Oh my God.
And then putting them to work in the brothels and then selling them off to other cities. You we can laugh and joke about
on auction blocks like they did the slaves.
Right.
Like, that's what I'm picturing.
I don't know how it worked. I didn't want to get more into that because it's too disturbing.
It's so disturbing.
Like when with fun and rowdy, body humor with the sex workers and stuff, a lot of them were not doing it willingly. Some of them were, though. So it's too complicated. Anyway, so in 1914, because we're ahead of everything here in Washington State, before national prohibition, Washington State ratified Initiative 3, which would make it illegal to manufacture or sell alcohol, but not to consume it.
Oh, they did that with the weed when they did that. That was the first thing. You could have it, but you couldn't buy it.
Right. Yeah, same thing. You couldn't buy it or sell it, but you could consume it. So the law went into effect in 1916. So this law was not as restrictive as the nationwide law that would go into effect a few years later. Washington residents were allowed to import, so either from other states or from Canada. Actually, no, probably not Canada, because Canada's prohibition did not end until 1919. So from other states, because there were other states that were not dry. I don't think Oregon, Idaho went dry as quickly as Washington did, and I think California just hung on until national prohibition. So California was a big supplier of booze when Washington State was dry. So they were allowed to import either a half a gallon of hard liquor or one case of beer per month.
Per household or per?
I think it was per resident.
Okay.
Yeah. Wait, could you count your children as residents?
Right. That's what I was thinking. Probably it was.
You're like, I have 9 children and they all have needs for whiskey.
There's no age restriction, but there's other restrictions.
So in addition, you could buy medicinal alcohol at a pharmacy with a doctor's prescription. So complaints of back pain and trouble sleeping shot through the roof. And in that year, 65 new drugstores sprang into existence in just 3 months.
With only liquid medicine.
Exactly. And it would literally just say medicinal whiskey on it.
Oh my gosh.
And that was it.
Start coming out with Jack Daniel's medicinal whiskey.
Exactly. Like, this glass of wine is medicinal. It's making me a better person.
Medicinal Merlot.
Let's start a winery. Medicinal Merlot. You could also find illicit booze at soda shops, which would add a special quote unquote syrup to your soda for a fee. So lots of these soda shops were bars that reopened as the new innocent seeming businesses.
Nice.
So they would just pivot. So you had to know how to ask for the special syrup they kept behind the bar that was booze.
But do you think these places where you'd go when you had to learn how to order it, would like each drugstore have the same way to order it?
I don't know. That's interesting.
Like, so you had a code that was across the board.
That's a great question that we should ask Brad. So speaking of Brad Holden, author, historian, extraordinaire.
Extraordinary.
He is going to come on the podcast this August because he has agreed to team up with us to do a special episode for Tacoma Beer Week. And so he's like, I know a lot about the Tacoma beer companies and the biggest bootlegger in Tacoma, Pete Marinoff, who started Marinoff Beer.
Awesome. So we're going to have lots of questions.
Yeah. So that is, save that little nugget in your brain and let's ask Brad, because he might know what like the code is, how to get the special soda. Yeah. I love that. Now, prohibition type laws with dry towns and dry counties in Washington had already started up a pretty robust black market for booze. Bootleggers would simply buy alcohol in counties or states that were wet and transport it to Seattle. So once Initiative 3 passed, the Seattle Police Department created a dry squad with officers raiding speakeasies and private homes. The mayor at the time, Hiram Gill, who we will talk about on a bonus episode in the Patreon, was putting on a show of cracking down on the slingers of illicit booze.
Putting on a show.
Hiram Gill was very good at putting on a show. His dry squad would burst into these establishments and homes, destroying the places with axes and sledgehammers. They even raided the home of William E. Boeing.
Oh,
yes, that
Bill Boeing.
Seizing several bottles of whiskey, a few cases of beer, and destroying their extensive wine cellar.
Destroying. I was picturing them taking them and keeping them, but no, they destroyed.
That did happen. Believe me, you.
Because I was thinking Bill Boeing probably had some nice high-end liquor. He wasn't getting the gut rot that everybody else was getting.
Oh, no. His stuff was
medicinal
quality.
whiskey.
And let me tell you, Brad has said, I listened to him on a couple of podcasts, and he said the dry agents, a lot of them were raging alcoholics, and they would just steal the confiscated liquor and get drunk, including the head of the federal dry squad. Eventually died of a stroke, and they say it was because of alcoholism and cigarettes.
I don't doubt. So that makes sense.
We'll get to him.
It almost makes them more effective at their job by making them the addict, right? It drives them to get it done.
Yeah. And
they're
so maybe like they smash half of it, and the rest they're like, we're taking it in for evidence. And then they would put on these big shows and have photographs taken of them smashing bottles, but then you don't know what they're keeping back.
Right.
I mean, this was a time before cameras, so you could easily steal stuff.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody, as we'll come to learn, everybody on the police force was corrupt. So all you had to do was slip a little bit of money to somebody and they will happily look the other way.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, yeah. We've seen that in multiple stories we've had so far. Yeah. Money tax.
So Roy Olmstead, although not a member of the dry squad, was a participant in several of these raids and arrests. After coming to Seattle from Nebraska in 1904, he worked for a shipyard until joining the Seattle Police Department in 1907. A big guy, he had an infectious smile, a keen mind, and he was liked by everyone. He always had a kind word and a laugh for anyone, no matter their station in life. He had such a positive reputation that his fellow officers referred to him as the baby-faced lieutenant.
Oh.
And I'll post some pictures of him on Instagram. He was just looked like the nicest guy. Like, I want to be friends with this guy.
Oh.
So he rose quickly through the ranks of the force with his hard work and was promoted to sergeant in 1910. He also had two brothers on the force, Frank and Ralph. The new Seattle chief of police, Joe Warren, is impressed with Roy. He's intelligent and professional and a favorite of the whole force. He promotes him to acting lieutenant in 1917 and makes it permanent in January of 1920, just days after the first day of the beginning of the nationwide prohibition laws, Amendment 18 and the Volstead Act. So Amendment 18 went into effect, I think, it went into effect first, and then the Volstead Act was what actually made it official and like, we're doing it. And so it was January of 1920 that nationwide prohibition went into effect. So that New Year's Eve was the wildest New Year's Eve that this nation has ever seen, ever. Because bars were like, we have to get rid of all our stock.
It's a fire sale.
Yeah. And it was. And Brad has a bunch of pictures in his book of bars and liquor stores that had put up like, it's all on sale, buy it, because they had about a year leading up to this. So they just had to get rid of their stock. Like nobody was bringing in new stock. Yeah, it was insane. And I can't even think about like the amount of jobs lost.
Yeah.
That's insane. Like that.
And it sounds
maybe
just
the Great Depression had more to do with prohibition than anything else.
Right.
Because all these people that were employed in the
that's what I was
industry
thinking. That's
lost their jobs.
That's a lot of money going around that's not going around now. And how did that in fact impact that, states, counties, cities?
Well, taxes.
Right. With taxes, it seems like it would be
I mean,
a bad move.
We are economic experts, so we definitely can talk about this. During his years working for the police force before the Volstead Act went into effect, Roy Olmstead, oh, by the way, you've probably, you hear Olmstead and you're probably like, that name's really familiar. This is not the Olmstead of famed Seattle architecture. Olmstead was actually a very popular name in the early 1900s in the Seattle area.
It's German. I feel like it's German.
Probably. It sounds like that. And there was a very famous actress named Gertrude Olmstead. So when I was looking through newspapers.com and I just put in Olmstead, I was weeding through dozens and dozens of articles about Gertrude Olmstead and whatever film she was appearing in at this point, or play or whatever. So Roy Olmstead had opportunity to observe the dark world of bootlegging. Local bootlegging operations were unorganized and inept. They kind of sucked at it. Sometimes poisonous moonshine would be confiscated, contaminated with wood alcohol or methanol, which can cause blindness and death. So here's the thing. They would do a lot of food scraps, fruit scraps, and then they would throw in wood scraps into that and ferment it. And when you ferment wood, it creates methanol, and also it is also used in a lot of like industrial solvents and stuff like that. It is strong. And also, when you distill, you have to eliminate the first bits that come out because that has a lot of methanol in it. And so they call that, there's the heads and the tails that you always eliminate in distilling, because that's the stuff that has a really high concentration of dangerous chemicals in it. And it can be used like acetone.
Oh.
Like you can use
remove nail polish.
To remove nail polish or sap from your car or something like that. Yeah, it's the nasty stuff.
Or your guts from yourself if you drink it.
Or it attacks your optic nerves.
Oh.
That's how it causes blindness.
That
and then
makes
it can cause death. Fun times. Bad moonshine was a big problem during Prohibition. Something like 50,000 deaths caused by bad moonshine. In addition, members of the dry squad, like we said, were sometimes arrested for stealing the confiscated alcohol, which they would drink or sell, and bribes pretty often greased law enforcement's palms. He also noted that what the local bootleggers lacked in organization and business acumen, they made up for in money. Lots and lots of money.
Untaxed hidden money.
So his sharp mind was ticking, and he was paid a pretty meager salary as a policeman.
Yeah.
And he formed a new plan, which we'll get into after the break. If you're a fan of quirky and offbeat historical tales, which I think you are because you're listening to this show, you'll love Plotting Through the Presidents, a podcast that delves into the bizarre, hilarious, and sometimes scandalous stories of America's presidents and their families. This show has quickly become one of my favorite podcasts. Hosted by Howard and Jessica Dorr, this podcast combines meticulous research with sharp humor, making history both entertaining and educational. Whether they're discussing presidential pets, untangling strange assassination plots, or exploring eerie mysteries, Howard and Jessica offer fresh and unique perspectives on historical events. Perfect for your commute, workout, or any moment you need a fascinating escape. Plotting Through the Presidents is a delightful mix of education and entertainment that I highly recommend. Take a listen.
I'm Howard Dory.
And I'm Jess Dory.
And we host Plotting Through the Presidents. We take deeply researched, deeply irreverent dives into the myths, mysteries, and scandals of the men and women who shaped America.
The only history podcast where you'll hear never-before-shared details about Thomas Jefferson's deadly ram and the truth about John Quincy Adams and the Mole People.
Yes! I bring the deeply researched narratives to Jess, who's hearing the story for the first time.
So I ground things a bit with my raw humanity.
So raw. We're diving into topics like how the first third party in America was founded by murder.
Murder.
The undeniable riz of Aaron Burr.
The what now?
And the odd feeding habits of everyone's favorite founder,
John Adams?
So whether you love history or you're lying to yourself, subscribe and follow Plotting Through the Presidents now to plot along with us.
Find out more and dive into previous bingeable seasons at plodpod.com.
I'll link Plotting Through the Presidents in the show notes. Now back to the show. So what's Roy up to? Well, he sees a striking opportunity. The new Volstead Act is significantly more restrictive than Initiative 3. Now it is illegal to import, export, make, sell, buy, or transport alcohol, or even have it.
Well, I was going to say, if you have any in stock, it's still not okay,
Yeah.
huh?
Prior to the Volstead Act, bootleggers would often get liquor from California, like we said before, running it up the coast on speedboats referred to as rum runners. So if it's in the sea, it's rum runners. If it's on land, it's bootleggers. Now that supply is gone, but Canada, in a convenient twist of fate, had just repealed their own prohibition in 1919.
Ooh, that's lucky for Seattle.
Thank you, Canada. You guys are so nice.
Sad
You
for
guys always are
Nebraska
so helpful.
and Texas, but us up here
Oh,
next
sure.
to Canada, we're good.
Mexicanada. They didn't seem to have any issue in exporting their fine Canadian whiskey.
I bet not.
So Roy saw the availability of good quality booze right at his back door, a great opportunity to fulfill a growing need for illegal alcohol in Seattle. Armed with the knowledge he had gleaned on his many raids with the police force, he decides to set up a tiny little side hustle as a bootlegger.
While being a police
Hashtag
officer?
girl boss.
Oh,
Boy boss.
boy boss. And he remains a
He's
police
still
officer.
working for the Seattle police force and enforcing raids and arrests
While being a bootlegger.
So he saw all of the corruption and police bribes, and he's like, oh, I can take advantage of that.
Yep. If
I'm doing a little
if you
shoulder
weren't doing
shimmer
that
here.
during this time, this era of the Seattle,
leaving money on the table.
You're just dumb.
But just a few months after his promotion to lieutenant, and not long after the start of Prohibition, agents from the newly formed Prohibition Bureau, controlled by the Treasury Department. So these are the federal agents. So Seattle Police Force had a dry squad, but then the feds came in and they had their Prohibition Bureau. So there were two entities that were promoting, and they were often at odds. Like, they hated each other. Like, the local police and the feds.
Territory
Always.
fight.
Yeah, absolutely. The Prohibition Bureau, so the feds, caught him in their very first organized effort to enforce the dry law in Seattle. On March 22nd, so remember, Prohibition went into effect January 1920. Roy and 10 members of his gang, which included Seattle police...
He's already got a gang.
He's already got a gang. Including Seattle Police Sergeant T.J. Clark, were unloading a shipment of Canadian whiskey at the Meadowdale dock near Edmonds, which is north of Seattle.
Yeah.
They loaded up the booze into their 6 waiting cars and started to motor up the hill. All of a sudden, they found their way blocked by a dozen federal agents who opened fire.
Just opened fire.
Oh, they loved to just shoot people back then.
With one of those machine guns with a little round thing.
Maybe. Actually, I think it was a lot of revolvers.
Oh, God, yeah.
But in a butthole clenching moment, starfish, Roy escaped by driving his car through the bushes and around the roadblock. Unfortunately, agents recognized his friendly round face and showed up at his home the next morning to arrest him. Not long after, he was dismissed from the Seattle police force. After pleading guilty to the charge, he was fined $500 and let go.
$500. Okay, I bet that's a lot then, though, but still.
He was already making a ton of money, so that was like pocket change.
It's like, okay.
She's like, fine,
Thanks.
great. Roy took this all in stride.
Did they take any of his booze?
Oh, they confiscated everything they found
when
there. Everything that he was
that
off
night. Yeah.
what anything they could get. I don't know what he had in his car. They didn't say. Maybe he had some in his car, and he was one of 2 cars that got away. So maybe there was some in the other car. Freed up from the responsibility of a full-time job, he could now focus on his side business. The dream. I mean, I'm jealous of Roy.
Ripe opportunity. Right time, right place.
Exactly. And he soon proved that he was a savvy businessman indeed. He knew that he needed to expand his business to make the most money. He needed bigger shipments of liquor, faster boats, more trucks, faster cars, and many more people working for him. But at heart, Roy was still a good man. He decided that his bootlegging business would be strikingly different from the violence of the East Coast. Instead of guns, he would pave the way with money. He already knew that there were plenty of corrupt cops on the Seattle police force. He adopts a code of no violence and no guns. So none of his people that work for him were allowed to carry guns. That's a big difference from the East Coast where murders happened all the time.
Around the bootlegging and...
Yes, exactly. In addition, he forbids his employees from engaging in the business of drugs, gambling, or prostitution. It's liquor, nothing else, no other vices. Leave that to somebody else. Further, he would have nothing to do with the poison hooch that his competitors were selling. He would deal in nothing but the best quality liquor from Canada.
High-end bootlegger.
He would not deal in stolen or hijacked booze.
Ooh.
So there was a lot of...
Morals, principles.
He had a lot of morals and principles. This was a stark contrast to how bootlegging was done all over the rest of the country, with gangs dealing in drugs and causing chaos on the streets.
And I bet in this area.
This approach to the business led him to be referred to as the good bootlegger, and sometimes the gentleman bootlegger.
Oh.
He was still the kind-hearted, likable guy that had rose through the ranks of the Seattle PD. He was known to shake the hands of everyone he ran into on the street, no matter what their race or occupation was, and always asking after people's families and with a kind word. He was quick to laugh and always had an infectious smile on his face. Like, he was like the type of guy that we would love. It was like if Keith was a bootlegger. Between his obvious skill as a businessman and ethical practices, he soon built a bootlegging empire that at one point was the largest employer in Seattle. He employed hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe it wasn't hundreds of thousands. Thousands of people. I may be being a little hyperbolic here. Because think about it. You have to have everybody to deal with every little thing, like your lawyers, your bookkeepers, all the people, lookouts, the people transporting stuff.
People doing the payoffs, coordinating all that.
Exactly. All that. I mean, he employed so many people. The joke was that Roy commanded more police officers as a bootlegger than he did as a police officer.
Oh, that's hilarious.
Before long, this was amazing. His business was grossing around $200,000 per month. Let that sink in.
Yeah.
That is not adjusted for inflation. That is 1920s money. So that is around $3.7 million per month today.
So he was paying well all these thousands of employees.
Yes. So he had somebody that was in charge of paying the Seattle police force. There was a set rate if you were just like a normal dude on the police force. And then there was a higher tier if you were sergeant, higher tier if you were a lieutenant. So you would pay this much and no more for whatever rank you were. But yeah, he had people in charge of all of that. And he paid, everybody was paid off. Everybody. It was insane.
He kept it rolling.
This was a fun fact. So Ken Burns did a whole prohibition thing, and he had an episode on PBS, and he had a whole episode about the good bootlegger, Roy Olmstead.
Oh, he did? Okay.
Yeah, it was really cute. I learned this fact from that one. So he kept some of his money at his home, heaped in a laundry basket, which he called his safe.
Laundry basket.
His organization brought in about 200 cases of booze daily.
I was going to say, it has to be a lot of booze.
Yeah. This immense success would also earn him the moniker, the King of the Bootleggers. Now, I am leaving out a lot of details about his organization because this would be a 3-hour podcast. And I'm going to encourage everybody to go read Brad Holden's book because all the details that are some very good details are in that book. Like I was reading it on our recent camping trip and I think Rich was getting a little irritated because I kept going, did you know? His bed definitely being my favorite thing, which is a know-it-all.
Yes. It's one of the things I love about you.
I love sharing information when I learn it. When I'm like, this is so cool. Do you want to hear about this cool thing I just learned? And you're like, no.
I don't see you as a know-it-all.
So a fun tidbit I learned from Brad Holden's book, there was a bootleggers conference in Seattle.
Wait,
in the March of 1922.
Just openly do that.
Is that something you would have at the DoubleTree down by the airport?
Yeah. I mean,
do you get a swag bag?
Yes.
Is there a panel?
What was the fee? Did they have vendors? Booths? Was there a booth?
Did Vistaprint do a
flyers? Or
do a lot of
those
flyers,
signs and stuff? Yeah.
Anyway, at this gathering, the bootleggers set some good guidelines for good business practices, such as price ranges, and also an agreement to stay out of drugs, to stay out of the drug business.
Yeah.
Crazy. There's enough bootleggers in Seattle to have a conference.
They didn't realize it was drugs.
It was probably not at the DoubleTree.
No, not at the or maybe
there probably wasn't a DoubleTree at that time, but also not the Washington State Conference Center.
Convention Center.
I love the idea
before
of
that. I know. I was picturing that as I've been to conventions.
This is the 1920s. So sharp suits. Fedoras.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah.
Everybody's showing up in like a sharp 1920s sedan, like a Packard.
Right. And I was just hearing it.
Oh, that heavy. And they all souped up their engines. So it's like rumble.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my God. Can you imagine?
I can smell the cologne.
And the cigars.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and the armpits.
That was before antiperspirants.
Yes. It was normal. That was the smell of a man. And probably
a
woman. And
you wear those suits for years. He would have his rum runners meet Canadian ships up north, and then those speedboats would drop the shipments off on the northern Washington coast, where waiting cars would whisk it away to Seattle. Although, on Ken Burns' little bit, he said sometimes they were so bold, they would offload on the shores of Lake Union.
Just like, we're here. Like, what are you going to do?
In the middle of the day.
We paid all of you. What are you going to do?
Right.
What does a speedboat look like in 1920s?
They were mostly made of wood at that time. They were definitely different looking than the speedboats that we have today. I will post a picture of what it was. It looks more like a Chris Craft or like a combination between a Chris Craft and a like tugboat. I don't know. Anywho, they were fast.
Okay.
And it's actually very interesting. We'll get into that. To outrun federal prohibition agents and their boats, faster and faster speedboats were needed. Since the end of World War I, airplane manufacturers like the Boeing Company found themselves with a surplus of airplane engines. So some enterprising dude figured out that you could put an airplane engine in a boat. And soon all of the rum runners were speeding across the Salish Sea and the Puget Sound.
Jet fuel.
Yep. He built some powerful and expensive boats, the Zambesi, the Estrella, and the Elise. And in fact, William Boeing, because he was very enterprising, and he had all these leftover airplane engines.
And he had a beef with these people. They stole his whiskey.
Right. And he was a fan of the bootleggers and the rum runners, and he saw this need for fast boats. He actually created his own line of speedboats with airplane engines in them. He put an ad out in the paper for this new boat, and the day of the sale, because he's put it in the paper and he said on this day, June 15th or whatever it was, this boat is up for sale. Sold completely out of them in 6 hours, if that tells you anything.
Wow.
So in addition, Roy would have his fleet of cars and trucks souped up with a bigger, faster engines so they could evade the federal dry agents and police, which led to the first hot rods and eventually NASCAR.
Oh, wow.
NASCAR is directly descended from bootleggers.
Straight from the nice bootleggers era. Or
Nice.
This guy. What was his name? The nice bootlegger?
Roy Olmstead.
Yeah.
So at this time, anti-prohibition Doc Brown was mayor of Seattle, making life even easier for Roy. I think I might do a whole episode on Doc Brown. He was a dentist who became the mayor of Seattle and was very disliked by all of the dry people.
I feel like I heard about him in the underground tours.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. He was quite a character. So Doc decided that he would focus his prohibition efforts on moonshiners, as tainted moonshine was responsible for more destruction and death. So he would let legitimate bootleggers like Roy Olmstead continue, because he only imported fine Canadian whiskey. So nobody was dying from that unless they crashed their car or whatever. And so he's focusing on moonshiners that were producing the stuff that was tainted with methanol. So it also didn't hurt that Roy's two brothers were still on the police force. In fact, under Mayor Doc Brown, his brothers were quickly promoted and given coveted beats. Doesn't hurt to have friends.
No. Got to pay the right people.
Yep. So life was good for the baby-faced bootlegger. He had power, ridiculous amounts of money, and now he even had love.
Got himself a lady, did he?
Oh, yeah.
Or?
By his side was the beautiful and charming Elsie, or maybe it's Elise. She has many aliases. His second wife. His first wife, Viola, divorced him in 1924. She even sued him, claiming he had been openly living with another woman while still married to her. Roy claimed to be broke, but a settlement was later reached out of court and the divorce was granted. That other woman was Miss Elise Carolyn Page, a vibrant young woman who left her home of England and headed out to Seattle in the 1920s. She met Roy in Vancouver, Canada.
On a pickup?
Maybe. I don't know. They didn't actually give details. They just said they met in Vancouver. Soon after coming to Seattle, federal prohibition agents recruited her to infiltrate Roy's bootlegging operation. She began to ensconce herself into Roy's life and day-to-day business operations and would report back to federal dry agents.
His wife was a spy.
Well, it wasn't his wife yet.
Okay.
Described
This
as
other
a
woman was a spy.
Described as a handsome woman.
Oh.
She was considered by the Prohibition men to be their most reliable volunteer informant on the operations of Roy and his men. Based on her detailed information, they managed to raid whiskey caches, seize cars, and arrest some of Roy's men. But Elise had something bigger planned. She said she was going to break Olmstead by appearing before a federal grand jury and testifying about what she knew. Agents thought this would give them enough evidence to bring down the whole Pacific Coast liquor smuggling ring.
Ooh, I can't imagine their glee.
All hinged on her testimony. One afternoon in 1924, Elise left the dry agent's office, promising to come back the next day before going into the grand jury room. The next day, she phoned them up and said that she was with Roy, but would be with them within an hour. She never showed up. Next thing they heard, She and Roy were married.
And she was protected from testifying.
Elise, or as we probably will call her for the rest of the story, Elsie, and we'll see why, had fallen in love with Roy. And instead of turning him in, had decided to join him. It's actually kind of
His
a fun,
charm.
sweet story. Like, she was going to bring him down, and he is such a nice guy, so charming. Everybody loved him. She could not resist his personality.
Baby face, nice bootlegger was
And I haven't
won her
read
over.
a single bad thing about this guy. Now, of course, it was the 1920s.
Well, he was breaking the law. That's about a dumb law.
Yeah, a dumb law that we don't agree with, but there's nothing that I read about him other than the fact that he was a bootlegger and breaking the law and paying off police officers. There was that. But like, as far as him and his personal life, I didn't read a single bad thing. Everybody loved him. He was nice to everybody and loved his wife. Now, okay, wait, well, let's back up. He did cheat on his first wife.
With her. But I mean, it was during her spy era. She had to do it.
Right. So I love Elise, or Elsie, as a character in the story. I wish there was more about her, because mystery and questions surround Elsie like the Pacific Northwest fog. Some researchers believe that she was involved in intelligence gathering during World War I. She has a list of aliases: Vivian Potter, Elsie Campbell, Elise Carolyn Paish, and finally, Elise Carolyn Olmstead. Papers of the time printed the rumor that she had abandoned a husband and family in Canada when she came to the U.S. But I found one article. I couldn't find anything else of any of the current researchers that said this too. But I did find an article from the 1920s that claimed this. They were also who printed all these aliases. So we know how journalistic standards were in the 1920s.
Absolutely.
Could be lies. There's
freedom with the truth.
Exactly. Artistic license. There's debate on how involved she was in her husband's operation. Most historians agree that she probably knew everything about his business, but disagree about her level of involvement. Her daughter states that she ran the business books, and there is speculation that she helped Roy send out coded messages in a radio show she ran, but there's no proof of it. This was a rumor that started at the time in the 1920s, and there's no proof. So it's debated whether that is true, and we'll get into that radio show. But what does seem true is that she was independent and smart and loved the lavish life that her bootlegger husband gave her. She was fond of furs, jewels, and expensive clothing. Together, they purchased a mansion in the Mount Baker neighborhood and would have fabulous parties. And newspaper articles at the time quoted people who knew her and described her as a gracious and entertaining hostess. Entertaining hostess.
In her taint, she hosted.
Oh, goodness. And I will post some beautiful pictures of her and Roy in gorgeous 1920s.
Oh, I love
outfits.
it.
There's some great pictures of them.
Was she handsome?
She was handsome. She had that flapper haircut with the little pin curls.
I'm just picturing all this.
I know. Roy had made friends with a bright young inventor named Alfred Hubbard, who he quickly set up in the basement of his own home. There, Al would tinker in his lab with all sorts of different inventions, including a radium-based X-ray machine and ways to use radium to affect different health problems. So this was in the height of radium as a positive new discovery that would help humans before we knew that it would put holes in your bones and make you die. So there was an article where a journalist went to this lab, and Al Hubbard and Roy Olmstead were showing all of these inventions that Al was working on in the basement of his home. And there was an X-ray machine, and they were all taking turns sticking their hands and faces under this X-ray machine, and you could see the bones, and they were like, oh, isn't that cool? And then there was this quote where Al said, alarmingly, this gave me shivers. Then I have done some work in softening bones. By using radium, the bones may be softened and straightened. Then the blood is turned in again, and it will remove the substance, restoring the bones to normal strength. It just gave me shivers because I'm like, you guys don't know what you're playing with.
Not at all.
Oh,
I know.
You're killing people.
I was watching a documentary about when it first came out, and they were just freely doing it. We had up until like
sell it in bottled water as a health tonic. You would go sit in Radium Springs for health because it made you glow before it killed you.
Right. So crazy.
Look up anything about the Radium Girls.
It's so tricky to make you, it feels like health until it's not.
But his biggest contribution, that'd be Al, was a massive radio tower at the Olmsted home, which Roy and Elise used to start Seattle's first radio station.
Ooh.
KFQZ.
KFQZ. AM, I assume.
Probably.
They didn't have FM, I'm assuming.
Elsie or Elise had her own program where, under the pseudonym Aunt Vivian, would read bedtime stories to children.
I feel like we have a special connection with her while we're
I love
doing
her
our podcast.
so much.
I
know.
She had her own radio show.
Exactly. So eventually Roy adds a radio tower to the top of Smith Tower, which at the time was the tallest building east of the Rockies, and adds live jazz to the lineup. His radio station will eventually become Como.
Oh, wow.
So unfortunately...
Still here today.
It is still here today. Unfortunately, all good things must end, which we will get into after the break. Unbeknownst to Roy, Prohibition agent William M. Whitney was determined to bring him down. He began a stakeout of Roy's house and instructed his men to try to gather as much information about the bootleggers' operations as possible. However, this was tough, as Olmsted basically owned half the city through his generous payoffs. Then, Whitney had a genius idea. He decided the best course of action was to tap Olmsted's phone. So this was still a new technology up this time.
Yeah, I was thinking phones are pretty new.
Yeah.
So is the tapping.
He had local stenographers transcribing the tapped phone calls and would present these documents every day to his superiors. Using the wiretaps, Whitney was able to discover many secrets about Roy's operation. However, Whitney had a reputation for being a total asshole. And pretty soon, one of his wiretappers, who was disgruntled at his low wages and Whitney always being an asshole to him, tipped Roy off that he was being listened to.
Oh my gosh. That's what you get for being a good guy.
Yep.
In the bad world.
So now Roy's playful side comes out. He decides to use this new knowledge as an opportunity to mess with the dry agent.
Oh, I love it.
So he begins to give misleading information out over the phone, which causes Whitney to wait all night on a cold beach, waiting for a shipment of booze that was never going to show up. Roy was tickled by this.
I already like this guy. Now I love him.
Yep. This is my favorite part. Sometimes he would get on the phone with some of his associates and talk about what a, quote, incompetent dimwit Whitney was, which would send the agent into fits of rage.
Oh, I love it.
Because remember, he has stenographers transcribing all of this, and then he has to give all those transcriptions to his superiors so they hear all of this shit talk. I love it so much.
Brilliant.
So, of course, that just enraged Whitney more, though, and he's more determined to get Roy.
Right.
And he was not about to give up.
Does he figure out that he's been had? Like, does he figure out that Roy knows and that's why he's saying these things?
I don't know. He doubled down on the surveillance and wiretapping of Olmsted's operation. Soon, he had enough evidence for a search warrant. It was a cool and damp evening on November 17th, 1924. The affluent neighborhood of Mount Baker was quiet. Most everybody inside was having dinner with their families. Whitney and his army of dry agents descended on the Olmsted house carrying axes, revolvers, shotguns, and sledgehammers. They pounded on the solid mahogany door. "Open up! We have a search warrant for these premises." I made that part up, but probably. The door swung open, and there stood Roy Olmsted himself, casual and friendly. "Good evening, officers. Please come in."
Why do I picture him in a robe and boxers? I don't know why.
As he swung the door wider and invited the agents into his posh home. Inside were Roy's good buddy Al Hubbard and another man. Whitney pointed his gun at the men and ordered them into the dining room. Agents ran upstairs and barged into the bedroom that Elise used as her radio studio. She was live on air, reading a story for her Aunt Vivian radio show. The agent pointed a gun at her and commanded her to shut it down and join her husband downstairs. Then the agents
Live on air?
Yeah, live on air. Then the agents proceeded to search the home for contraband. Oh, I think also there was some report that she said, "I'm going to call the police." And they're like, "The police are already here." Mm-hmm. Well, she wanted to call the people that were
her
friendly.
Police.
Yeah,
her
exactly.
Police.
Then the agents proceeded to search the home for contraband. They found some tax records, some bookkeeping, but not a single bottle of booze. The problem is one of Roy's men, who did not know about the raid, was coming over for a visit, and he showed up with a half empty bottle of whiskey. So they immediately arrested him, and then Whitney got an idea. So here's the other thing that's ridiculous. You want to know who Whitney invited to join him on this raid? His wife.
His own wife.
So when he had everybody at gunpoint in the dining room, she just waltzed into the house like she owned the place.
He had to show her he wasn't incompetent.
Exactly. Look, honey, all those long hours, I wasn't just drinking contraband booze. So he set up on the dining room with the Olmstead's phone. And so his wife, who was there, sat with him. Yep. So the phone rang. And so Whitney answered, doing his best Roy Olmsted impression. The caller wanted to drop by, and Whitney encouraged him to come over and bring a bottle. Then, because Whitney had compiled a list of phone numbers of Roy's associates, he started calling them up one by one and said, we're having a party, bring some booze. And his wife pretended to be Elsie. So between the two of them, they got something like 30 people to come over. They kept it up until 2:30 in the morning. And every time one of these prospective partygoers showed up at the house with booze, they would get arrested. And then the next person would show up. So upon hearing about this raid, Mayor Doc Brown was furious. He said, there is a difference between enforcing the law and making it a grandstand play. They could raid my home in the same way. Come to my house and search it, find no liquor, then telephone bootleggers who would bring it. They could raid Reverend Matthew's house in the same way.
Because they didn't find alcohol till somebody brought it over.
Exactly. And they tricked people into bringing it over.
Yes. Coercion.
Exactly. Which, unfortunately, at that time wasn't much of a defense.
Right. Probably wasn't a thing.
Yeah. Although Olmstead's lawyer tried to argue that the arrest was illegal, Roy, Elsie, and 89 other defendants were indicted. This included restaurant owner Doc Hamilton, who I think we might do a little episode about for the Patreon because he is an incredible character. Roy Friend's Al Hubbard, he's going to be an upcoming episode all on his own. He's incredibly interesting. And several of Roy's top men. This was known as the Whispering Wires case and was the largest prohibition legal trial in history.
Wow.
One by one, through intimidation and lies, Whitney convinced 30 of Roy's best customers to testify him, including William Boeing. Now, this was a really fun tidbit, which I didn't write down, but I'm going to recall right now. When William Boeing was on the stand testifying, he gave deliberately vague responses to every single question, so his testimony did nothing for anybody.
He's like an expert.
He's so smart.
Did he go on to be a politician? I don't think so, but
I don't know.
Sounds like it could have been.
So Whitney even caught the jury foreman alone and threatened him.
Oh, my.
So that this foreman would convince the rest of the jury to offer full indictments against Roy and the other defendants. So Whitney was fine playing below the belt or whatever.
Do what you got to do, apparently.
Yeah. And he would also doctor those transcriptions to serve his purposes.
Like the transcriptions from the wiretaps?
Yeah, from the wiretaps. But Roy, true to form, posted bail and went right back to work. But now he's going to implement new schemes to bring booze in. So he started implementing the railway.
Ah, nice.
Unfortunately, his good friend Al Hubbard was kind of a weenie and turned against him. So he turned into an informant in exchange for having his name dropped from the indictment. He gave Whitney the detailed and intimate information that he needed to finally get Roy. He also managed to get Whitney to appoint him as a federal prohibition agent, although in a limited capacity.
I'm out of a job if I do this. I'm going to need one. Oh, gosh.
But Sneaky Al learned well at Roy's feet. He served as a double agent, providing info to the feds, but also playing the other side and pocketing payoff money.
Nice.
So, yeah. Ultimately, it was Al Hubbard who led us to that final scene at the Woodmont dock on Thanksgiving Day, 1925. Al Hubbard, who remember was playing both sides, was put in handcuffs right alongside his friend Roy and later had to talk his way back into Whitney's good graces because he had to explain why he was still working for Roy when he was supposed to be a federal prohibition agent. And there would now be a second trial. So try as he might to paint Roy as an upstanding citizen and having nothing to do with the bootlegging, Olmstead's attorney ultimately failed. They tried to have the wiretaps ruled as inadmissible, claiming that the evidence was unconstitutional because there was no precedent for this.
Well, and he's altering it. How do you know he's not?
Right. So unfortunately, the judge, who was a big Dry fan, ruled against them. And this trial set a lot of precedent for wiretapping that
That's what I was
still
thinking.
has ripples today. After a month of trial, all 90 defendants were found guilty. Most of them were given just like fines. I think it was like $8,000 and then 18 months in jail. But Roy had a second trial coming up. And so since he had the second trial coming up, he was not immediately reprimanded to jail. He was still out doing his thing. So he put his house and radio station up for sale to cover his legal costs. So the once rich man was now broke. So remember, he was bringing in $3.7 million in today's money per month. Now, of course, he was the biggest employer in Seattle, so
Right.
a lot of that went out, but he still had money. He had a lavish lifestyle. Now he's broke. So in October of the same year, the second trial began, this one covering all of his criminal activities after the original raid on his house, including that arrest at Woodmont Beach. His former bestie, Al Hubbard, was the star witness. Roy was found guilty of all charges, but no additional time was added. So he was convicted to serve 4 years. With his friends and family there to see him off, he boarded the ship for McNeil Island with one final goodbye to his wife. This is my favorite part of the whole story. His reputation preceded him to the prison. The prison warden met him at the gates and said, "I'm sorry, but we don't have any bartender jobs open just now."
Oh my gosh.
True to his form, Roy roared with laughter. So Roy spent his time in prison reading and studying in the library. He had a keen interest in religion and philosophy and eventually embraced the teachings of the Church of Christ scientist. Emerging from prison, a staunch teetotaler and a
really?
religious man, he moved into a small apartment with his wife and 2 daughters because he was broke.
Same wife,
Yeah.
at least. Okay.
Working for a pest control company and then as a furniture salesman.
Wow. What a different,
How the mighty have
change of
fallen.
events.
Elsie had been actively petitioning for him to be pardoned. And in 1935, he was exonerated by the president.
Of the United States, huh? When does Prohibition end?
Prohibition was repealed in 1933. And now beer and wine was allowed up to 3.2%, which is still nothing. Coors Light is even
More, it's like 4.5, right?
The first legal drink in almost 2 decades in Seattle was served up at midnight on April 7th, also known as New Beer's Eve, which I think we should start celebrating
Yes.
from now on.
Where's
April
my phone?
7th.
I'm putting this
Put
in
it in
calendar.
there.
It's
New
going in the
Beer's
calendar.
Eve is April 7th, and which is also perfect because my birthday is April 5th. So let's just
yes.
have my birthday be on April 7th, and it's going to be New Beer's Eve, also Shay's birthday.
Yes, I'm putting it in my calendar for next year.
Thus ends the tale of Roy Olmsted, whose legacy as the gentleman bootlegger was cemented in the annals of Prohibition history. The great experiment of Prohibition, intended to purify the nation, had instead birthed a complex underworld of speakeasies, smuggling, and figures like Olmsted, who deftly navigated its treacherous waters. His tale stands as a testament to the unintended consequences of legislating morality, a reminder that in the shadow of every law lies the human spirit's unyielding drive for freedom and ingenuity. For freedom and
Ingenuity.
freedom and ingenuity. Ingenuity. For freedom and
ingenuity. You
What
can play all
say.
4 of them.
Freedom and ingenuity.
There you go.
Yay, me! I want to thank Brad Holden again, the author of the book Seattle Prohibition, Bootleggers, Rum Runners, and Graft in the Queen City, not Cream City, Cream Corn. It was a great read. Fantastic work. I highly recommend everybody go read it. It's so good. And I will link to Brad's website where you can read more about it and his other books. And I've got another one of his books about Al Hubbard, loaded up, ready to go. That's going to be my next episode is Al Hubbard. I'm so excited. This might be the summer of bootlegging. It might be the summer of Prohibition because there are so many characters.
Right. It sounds like it. There are, stars of the show for that era. Yeah.
It's so good.
That was fun. I mean, are you done? Because I'm famous for cutting you off in your story.
Well, I was just going to say the exciting news about him helping, we already talked about it, him going to do an episode with us for Tacoma Beer Week. And then also, as always, every single episode, I get information from historylink.org, which I feel like we should give money to because we get so much information from them.
Well, if we ever start making some, maybe we'll send.
I know. Well, maybe we should do a fundraiser for HistoryLink. At some point, help in a fundraiser. I also got help from Steve Edmondson, who is the filmmaker that was part of the Maury Island incident movie, and he's the one who organizes the Men in Black birthday bash, which is happening this Friday and Saturday and Sunday, which we'll be at. And he's also written about Roy Olmstead, and he gave me some great resources because he's really interested in Roy Olmstead and the whole story. And then there was also a fantastic KUOW NPR article about Elsie or Elise Olmstead, which was really interesting.
Nice. I love that story. I really, really am sad that I didn't get to hang out with these people.
I know.
Especially I was thinking, like, we've met so many interesting characters just doing this. I could picture us running into them and totally have been friends and run into these people and
absolutely
and had them part of our circle, like all the fun people we've met so far.
Yeah, I really had such a good time researching this. It was super fun.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah. It was a great listen.
Here's the other thing is I posted his book on the History of the Puget Sound Facebook group, and had several people reach out to me and said that their grandfathers were part of Roy Olmstead's organization. So in the light of that, because they had stories, I would like to propose to our listeners, if you have a personal story or a family story that relates to one of our podcasts, we would love it if you would send that in to us, because I think we should do an episode of listener stories.
Oh, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
We've had a few reach out to us already, so that'd be great.
Yeah. Any of our episodes. So go to our website.
It's like, wait, how did you know?
So go to our website, rainydayrabbitholes.com, and our landing page is now just our podcasts, so you don't have to search for it. Go through those. Are there any stories on there that you have some sort of personal connection to with your family or yourself? And then email me at Shea, SHEA, at rainydayrabbitholes.com, and then we can feature your story on an upcoming episode.
I love that idea. Yeah, I'm so excited to hear this. Please, please, please reach out.
Also, please, please, please help us to grow by subscribing to our Patreon, where we now have our very first bonus episode, which
you want to hear.
You want to hear.
Maybe you don't. Maybe you'll regret it. You'll regret it, maybe.
It's pure filth. It's all about Bigfoot erotica.
You can't go without hearing it. If I had to pick.
It's good. It's bad.
If I had to experience it. No, I'm just kidding.
I think it's worth it. It's worth $5 for sure. So for just $5 a month, you can get access to this bonus content. Now, if you go up on the tiers, you get more, but that's all $5 a month. Like, that's not even a Starbucks coffee.
No.
Yeah.
It's half
once
of one
a month.
These days.
And that'll help us to pay off the mountain of podcast debt we have. That doesn't even, one $5 a month thing doesn't even scratch the surface of what we pay monthly just to run this podcast. So we would appreciate your support and your help. And if you don't want to support us with dollar bills, you could just support us by sharing the podcast and subscribing following on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And also, if you were to subscribe to us on our website, so you can actually subscribe to us on our website, you can subscribe to our newsletter. We're only going to send it out once a month. We're not going to spam you, but it's going to have fun stuff about the Pacific Northwest.
First one's out, and it is fun.
What's going on around here, what's going on with us, and we like to do a what happened in Pacific Northwest history portion on that. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for hanging in. Also, I just wanted to check with you guys. Who listens all the way through to hear the little stingers I put after the closing music? Besides my brother. I think he's the only person.
You really want to, because it's where she takes the things that I say, cut that and don't leave that in there. I don't want you to hear it.
I put the stupid stuff at the very, very end. So always listen all the way through, because you might get just a fun little tidbit that'll make you laugh. Anyways, thank you guys. We really appreciate it. We will see you next time.
See you down the rabbit hole.
The salty tang of the Puget Sound could be tasted on the air. Sorry, salty tang tasted. I did not realize when I wrote this was be so sexual.